If you're interested in Aurora photography, stay tuned for my discussion of Aurora photography with Dan Carr. Hello and welcome to episode number 108 of the Photographing the West podcast. I'm your host, Kirby Flanagan, and I'm a nature and wildlife photographer. If you're new here, welcome. If you're not new, welcome back. In either case, do me a favor and hit the subscribe button. Dan Carr is a commercial, editorial, and fine art photographer based in the Yukon Territory of Northern Canada. He has lots of opportunities to do Aurora photography, and he's going to explain some of the fine points of Aurora photography today in our discussion. Welcome back, Dan. By their very nature, Aurora are somewhat unpredictable. What tools do you use to predict the presence of Aurora?
Yeah, that can be tricky. There are a lot of smartphone apps, though. I'm an iPhone guy, and there's a whole range of different applications. They do a reasonable job, but they're not infallible. There are certain types of auroral activity that you can predict based on previous sun activity, essentially. If there's a solar flare, there's a generally known time that the stuff that the sun is throwing out will then take, to reach the Earth. So there are some that are somewhat predictable based on solar activity, but it's definitely not an exact science. And then some of the best auroras I've ever seen have been ones that aren't predicted by these prediction apps. So they can be helpful, but if you really want to get the best out of things, then you can't rely on them. You basically can't beat being out there in the field and just watching what's happening. So I don't know off the top of my head, I don't know the exact name of the applications that I use, but I have written a guide to the best applications for that before. It's on my website, so I'm sure, Kirby, you could put a link in the show notes or the video description for this.
Sure.
If you don't already have that link, haven't come across it, I'll send it to you later. But there is a guide that I've done on my website to the apps that I do use for this.
Okay. That'll work.
It's kind of a combination because you need both the aurora activity predictions and you also need some knowledge of what the moon is doing as well, because the moon's size and position and the time that it's rising and setting is also important. So you have to have a combination of that along with a good weather forecasting app, because of course you need clear skies.
Sure.
And then you need the aurora predictions, to some extent as well. So it's kind of a combination of three different things that you'll end up using.
Okay. And experience, I guess, huh?
Yeah, definitely. I like I said, some of the best auroras I've seen have not been predicted by the applications. They will tell you what the current aurora activity is. And I can tell, usually I go out and walk my dog, for his evening walk at 9 o'clock at night. And I can tell right away if there's going to be a good night of aurora activity, because I'll start to see, some activity in the far distance. And so even if my app is telling me, there's not going to be anything special tonight, and I'm walking the dog at 9 o'clock at night and I see certain signs that it's already getting fairly active off on the horizon, then I just ignore what the app tells me at that point and just go out anyway. So there is, the apps are good. They're a good starting point, but you can't beat actually being outside and having a look yourself.
And being on a dark sky location, I'm sure.
Yes, of course, that is hugely important. Yeah.
And you probably get more chance to observe them up there in the Yukon than we do in the lower 48.
I would guess so. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of good dark sky locations. I think there's actually an application for dark sky locations as well, now that I think about it,
Right.
that gives you some indication of, potential light pollution. So I'm sure there are great places, especially down, well, I guess when you say lower 48, you'd have to be in the very northern part of the lower 48 in order to stand any chance of seeing the aurora.
Right.
But there would be some spots, but I'm very lucky here that I can, if I if I turn the lights off, I can basically look out of the window sometimes and just see them out the window because I live in a pretty remote place.
Right. Yeah. That definitely helps. So what's the secret to making great Aurora photos, would you say?
I have to say that location is definitely one of them. You're going to get very few opportunities to practice if you are at a lower latitude. So being in a place where I am, you get to see the aurora quite often. And that allows you to get out and give it a try. And that means you can make all those mistakes you're going to make and go through that learning process. If you live in a place where you might only see the aurora once a year, that puts a lot of pressure on you to get it right.
Right.
And so when I was living down south in British Columbia, I was near the Canada-US border there. And if I was lucky, I would see them once a year. And that definitely made it harder to get to grips with this type of photography. So location is one of them. If you're really into doing aurora photography, doing a trip to somewhere where there are more consistent auroras, might be a worthwhile thing to consider. But aside from that, you also need to have a really clear indication of how exposure works in your camera. Exposing for the aurora is a tricky thing for people that don't understand how to use a camera to manually expose a photo. So understanding aperture, shutter speed, and your ISO is really, really important if you're going to get good aurora photos, because you have to shoot in manual. So if you're a really beginner photographer and you don't understand that, then it would not be the right time to, for example, take a trip to Norway to try and capture the northern lights. You're not going to get the best out of it until you really understand how to use your camera and expose manually. So yeah, that would be probably the second thing, is having a really clear understanding of how those three things work to produce the final photo. And then the third thing is kind of remembering all of your compositional basics. A lot of people, especially if it's the first time they've seen the aurora, they get caught up in the fact that it is the aurora, and everybody wants to see a photo of the northern lights, and they just think, well, any photo of the northern lights is going to be great. So they fixate on getting the exposure right, and all of the compositional rules go out of the window, and they don't consider those. And you got to remember that a lot of people that are seeing photos of the aurora have seen a lot of photos of the aurora. So just because it's your first time seeing it doesn't mean that you can get away with kind of skimping on the compositional rules that make a strong image. So yeah, that's probably the third thing there, is just remembering all the same compositional rules that you would use for any landscape photo, and making sure that you apply those to a well-exposed image.
And having an interesting foreground, I would think, would be important.
Well, exactly. That's definitely one of the compositional things. You would consider that if you were doing a landscape photo, and the same thing is the same for a photo of the northern lights as well. That is exactly one of the things that often trips people up, is not putting anything in the foreground, not having some kind of a foreground element. And then what will happen is, inevitably the foreground is going to be very dark at night. You've got these bright lights in the sky, and you've got a dark foreground. And so oftentimes what you'll see is people will place the aurora in the top part of the image, and then the very bottom part of the image will be very, very dark. And if you don't put any objects in there, anything to break that up, then you just get this huge chunk of black at the bottom of the image, which really, really unbalances the image. So yeah, all of the compositional rules that you think about for landscape photography, that all applies for aurora photography as well.
So do you shoot in HDR or?
No, I mean, I guess
bracket your exposure.
The problem, I guess you could do that. It's not something that I do. For For me, I don't mind darker objects in the foreground as long as they are distinct objects. So you can use, you can break up the outline of a foreground object by having something brighter behind it, whether that be water that's reflecting the aurora, or getting down really, really low so that you have a foreground object that is crossing over into the sky to break up the sky a little bit. I think we'll see some photos later on where I've used those techniques. The difficulty with, the difficulty with bracketing your exposures is the way that the light plays. Like, often people think of the auroras as like a static thing, but if you have a really active aurora, these lights are dancing around. They're visibly moving. You don't need a camera to see that. So let's say you were going to try and bracket. Let's just say at its simplest point, you were going to do a 2-shot bracket. So you did one where you exposed for the sky and another where you exposed for the foreground. Well, necessarily that second shot there would be, maybe 30 seconds later. And the lights in the sky at that point could be very, very different to what they were 30 seconds previously when you took the sky exposure. So the coloring, the reflections on the ground, if it's snow, the reflections in the water, wouldn't match. The two exposures wouldn't match. If you were, it definitely wouldn't work if you were using water, but I would even be hesitant to do it if you were, having a snowy ground or something as well, because you can see the green reflections of the aurora in the snow sometimes. And so if you were trying to get things to match, that would be one reason why that wouldn't be what you want to do. Okay.
So you mentioned doing manual exposure. Do you use auto ISO or not?
No. Getting the exposure, getting the routine set out is really important. So for the exposure, I'll talk you through how I expose these images. Sure. From the very start, because this is a really key point. Well, first of all, you're going to need a lens that has a reasonably wide maximum aperture. So, something f2.8 is okay. F2 is better. F1.8 or 1.4 is really good. So you're going to look for a reasonably wide angle lens that has an aperture that is pretty wide as well. So I like the Sigma 14 millimeter f1.8, but I also like a 24 1.4. Those would be my two main lenses for doing Northern Lights photography. And then the next thing you're going to do is take some test shots. Now, hopefully you're going to do this before you see the Northern Lights. You have to have a few things in mind before you get out there. So you want to know at what aperture you're going to shoot at. Now, almost always that's going to be the absolute widest aperture that lens can go out. You want to let as much light in as possible. But if you've got yourself a really cheap wide angle lens, then sometimes there can be a huge amount of vignetting at the widest aperture. So you might end up stopping it down. Perhaps you've bought an f1.8 lens, but you want to use it at f2 because there's much less vignetting. So you have to know before you get out there what's your comfortable level of vignetting. And that will allow you to determine what your aperture is going to be. So I use the Sony G Master 24 1.4. I'm fine with using that at 1.4. Same with the Sigma 14 f1.8. That's fine at 1.8. So that is fixed. When I go out there, I know that's what my aperture is going to be. So that is one thing. You can just kind of take it off the table. You don't need to worry about that. You know what your aperture is going to be. Now, the next thing to think about is shutter speed. A lot of people go wrong here and just think, well, it's nighttime photography. I can just set a really long shutter speed and that's going to be fine. I can keep up my ISO nice and low and just go with a really long, like 30-second shutter speed. But the problem is that if you have really active aurora and they're moving around, they'll dance around the sky. So, they're dancing all over the place. And over 30 seconds, you might have a peak of light that moves from one side of the frame to the other side of the frame. So if you do a 30-second exposure, what you get is you just get a kind of a hazy green sky with not so much detail in it. So while you're watching it, you might see all these spikes of light and spires and, swirling things. But in a 30-second exposure, all of that just gets smoothed out and you don't see any of that detail. So you have to then, after you've chosen your aperture, you got to choose your shutter speed, and you have to do that based on how active the aurora is that you're watching. Sometimes it just hangs there in the sky and it doesn't move. And in that case, you can go with a longer shutter speed. But sometimes it's dancing all over the place, and I'm going for 2-second shutter speed instead of 30. So you have to kind of choose your shutter speed based on the activity of the aurora at that moment. And then once you've done those two things, then I then use the ISO to get myself to an exposure level that doesn't clip the highlights in the aurora itself.
Okay. So you look at the histogram, or?
Yeah, exactly. Look at the histogram. Put the flashing blinkies on, so when you're looking at the preview, you can check to make sure you haven't blown the highlights. And yeah, so I wouldn't trust the camera to pick the ISO at that point. So I would rather go with manual selection of that.
So do you ever have to go above 2 seconds?
You slower than 2 seconds?
No, faster.
Faster. I mean, in some cases you would want to, but you also have to keep in mind what ISO you're going to end up with. So yeah, sometimes I'll think, wow, that's really moving all over the place. It's going crazy. I'll look at a 1 second exposure, and then I'll realize that in order to get that 1 second exposure, my ISO would have to be 12,800. And so at that point I have to balance, like, okay, I'll get the sharpest spires of light, but the ISO is so high that the image is going to lose detail anyway. It's going to get kind of smeary and too grainy. In order to fix that in Lightroom, I would have to apply a huge amount of noise reduction, which then wipes out all the detail anyway. So you have to do a bit of a mental balance at that point. Okay, I'm going to sacrifice a little bit of the detail initially by using a slightly slower shutter speed, but I will be able to have a lower ISO. So a lot of that comes from experience in processing the images, and also experience with your camera. So you need to know the ISO response of your camera. If you don't know when you're in the field, if you don't know what ISO 8000 looks like, or 10,000 or 3200, you need to have a really good sense of what the final image quality is going to look like at those ISO values. So if somebody was going to say, take that trip of a lifetime to Norway or the Yukon or somewhere like that to get these Northern Lights photos that they've always wanted, that would be a thing to do before you go, is to go out on a dark night and take photos, correctly exposed photos. It doesn't have to be of the Northern Lights, it can be anything, but take correctly exposed photos at every ISO value that your camera has, and then really examine those in Lightroom to see where your own personal limits are based on what camera you're using. You'll be able to see, okay, well, these look fine, ISO 2000 looks fine. You might think on your particular camera, by the time you get to 4000, that's a horrible looking image. So you want to make a mental note then, okay, when I'm doing the Northern Lights, never go above 4000. Having an understanding of how your camera responds at different ISO values is really important.
Does using something like Topaz denoise help any with that?
Yep, I use denoise. It definitely does help. The problem with denoise is it's generally good, but it can be a bit quirky. You'll run it on some nighttime photos, and you have to run it in. It has a night mode, or it's a low light mode or something like that. I can't remember whether you call it low light or night mode. But denoise, one of the things that denoise does, it does a good job of denoising the image, but then it also sharpens the image. And that's often not what you want, because some nighttime images can be so noisy that even after it's denoised, it doesn't get rid of all of the grain. And so it then sharpens the grain. So you want to make sure that you're running it at a very low level, or you're using night mode. And then once you've done it, you need to really zoom in on the image and scan all over it for little pockets of weirdness, because denoise can sometimes, because it doesn't apply the same noise reduction across the whole image, it does it, uses its AI to say, okay, I'll do noise reduction here at this level and there at this level. every now and again in nighttime photos, I find that denoise will have like a few odd patches in the sky where it has not done the same amount of noise reduction as it has done elsewhere. So you then have to adjust the settings to try and fix that, or even take the image into Photoshop and clone out the area where it's done a terrible job and kind of fix it manually. So denoise is great. It'll do a better job than Lightroom as long as you're willing to put the time in at fiddling with it. So you wouldn't want to do it for 100 images, but if you've had a great night and you've got 2 or 3 of your best images, then it's worth taking the time to run it through denoise AI on 2 or 3 of them. Yeah.
Okay. Any other specialized software do you like to use?
No, that's it. I do it all Lightroom, and then if I have had to shoot at a higher ISO, maybe 5,000 and above, I will take it into denoise. I guess on some occasions I have also used Topaz Gigapixel AI if I want to blow the image up even larger. So one of the things I experimented with this winter was shooting with the Sony a7S III for my Northern Lights photos. The a7S III actually only has a 12 megapixel sensor, but people that know their Sony cameras will know, or cameras in general will know, that the a7S III is basically the king of darkness. That thing can see into the dark at incredible levels, at really, really low noise at higher ISOs. So one of the things I experimented with was shooting with that only 12 megapixel camera, but getting really, really clean photos. You just get incredibly clean images to start with, and then interpolating those images to a larger size using Gigapixel AI. We'll actually see an image when you run through the images in a minute. We'll see an image that was taken with the a7S III. And so originally, it's a 12 megapixel image, which is nothing by modern camera standards, but you would never know that unless I told you. And you would have no trouble printing that at a huge size after it's been run through Gigapixel AI.
Good to know. Well, speaking of your photos, let's go ahead and take a look at them. Okay. So talk a little bit about this.
Yeah. So this is I think a lot of these ones are going to be from the Yukon. These are just some of my most recent ones, and I've been living here the last couple of years. So this is out on a frozen lake, and the issue that I had when I went to this location is kind of what we talked about before. A frozen lake is often a great place to get a good, wide, expansive view of the Northern Lights, but your problem is that there is not going to be any foreground detail. There's not going to be anything interesting in the foreground. So unless you just tilt the camera upwards and just have the mountains at the bottom of the frame, then you would always end up with some blackness at the lower part of the frame, which can, as we talked about before, can unbalance the shot a little bit. Now, these mountains were not that close to me, so their height in the image was relatively short, and I didn't feel like they could be the sole focus of the foreground. So in order to fix that, I had to put the camera on a tripod and put myself in the frame there to add a little bit of interest. Now, in some cases, you could do this and just have your silhouette crossing over into the sky. We'll see a shot that's similar to that in a second. But in this case, I wasn't able to do that. Just the focal length I was using wasn't appropriate for that. So I used the headlamp to cast some light onto the ice. If I hadn't had the headlamp on, imagine me standing there, you wouldn't be able to see me. There would be no contrast between me and the white of the ice. So I would just disappear into the blackness. So the headlamp is used there to create the white on the ice, and that's what allows you to see me standing there. And that gives you some balance in the image with the lights above.
And creates a little bit of a leading line, I guess, huh?
Yeah, exactly. So you're basically going to end up, generally your eye is going to fall to the brightest part of the image. So it's going to go to where I am, and that's high contrast as well. So brightness and high contrast is going to grab your attention, but then the leading line is going to be upwards, following that beam of light up to the northern lights. Yeah.
Okay, good, great shot.
Thanks.
How about now?
Okay. Yep. Got it.
I don't know why it does that, but anyway. Okay. So this is a unfrozen lake, I guess.
Yeah, this is, if you can find, we're going to have a recurring theme here is trying to deal with the foreground in a Northern Lights photo. You're always trying to find something to put in the foreground. And if you can find open water and get really low to that open water, you will get that reflective light, which helps to balance the lights in the sky. The difficulty is that if you're in the northern part of the northern hemisphere, then the time when we have enough darkness to see the northern lights is when it's much colder and there's often snow on the ground and only frozen lakes. So it's actually really unusual to get open water and also see the northern lights at the same time, because you're always fighting those long summer nights that we have here. I mean, I know the northern lights, for example, were pretty visible last night to some people, but up here, the sky's just not dark enough anymore. Already we're getting towards summer where we have 24 hours of sunshine up here. So right. I know there was a lot of aurora activity out last night. And of course, there is open water right now, but I wouldn't be able to photograph the northern lights anytime from the spring right until somewhere in October, really, when the nights start to get dark enough again. So this was taken, I believe, the very beginning of October. And it was really lucky. We had a great night of activity, but the lakes hadn't yet frozen. So if you find yourself in a situation like that, then using the reflection of the aurora is a great way to fill the foreground.
Sure. Yeah. Very nice. Okay, I think we've got one more here.
Yeah, so in this shot, the lights were bright enough to cast a bit of a green glow onto the snowy foreground. So that was useful. But I went to this location. This is actually an area where there had previously been a forest fire. So I knew that there was a lot of trees there, which I could use to break up the frame a little bit and basically have them sticking up into the sky to draw your eye up to the sky, but also to help break up that foreground as well. So that's another thing that you can always look out for is trees that are going to stick up into the sky and create that contrast. Contrast is always an interesting thing to have in an image, and putting black trees against the brighter aurora will always create that contrast and create an interesting image.
Plus, again, you've got nice leading lines. So,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this is just, I mean, I guess another thing is you can see the aurora in this image is very different from the one in the previous two images. You never really know what it's going to look like. Sometimes you'll get it in these big arcs across the sky with these spires of light going all over the place. And then sometimes you'll get these huge long streams like this, which just looks like a green highway in the sky. And, in this case, this wasn't really dancing or moving around a lot. It was just there. It was just hanging in the sky like that. So you have to sort of take that into account when you're composing things as well. So, I composed this one to kind of come up across from lower in the image on one side and draw that line up to the corner of the image. It was pretty static in the sky, so I could compose that shot and know that that's how it was going to be in the final image.
Okay. Well, I know you're tight on time, so I think we've looked at all the photos and covered a lot of material. So thank you for your time and for
you're welcome.
Some great insights into aurora photography. It's much more complicated than I would have imagined.
Yeah.
To get good exposure in particular. So.
Yeah, it can be a challenge. It's definitely something worth practicing. And I've written fairly extensively about individual aspects of aurora photography on my website. So, if people want to follow along, subscribe to the RSS feed on the website or one of the social channels, Facebook, Twitter, or something like that, you'll often see me talking about Northern Lights photography. I've done things like write about the best focal lengths and the best individual lenses, and as I said, the best apps for predicting the Northern Lights. So there's all kinds of tips on there if people are really into Northern Lights photography.
Okay. So all of those under Dan Carr?
Those ones are on Shuttermuse. So shuttermuse.com. If you want to throw a link in the description and the show notes for that. All my tutorials, my personal website has photos on it, but all of the tutorials are on Shuttermuse.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I will do that and try to get a list of those in the show notes so people can find them easily.
Yep.
And show your photos as well. So thanks once again, and we'll talk again, I'm sure.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kirby. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now. Thanks for being back on Photographing the West, Dan. Each episode is published on the 15th and 30th of the month. Tune in on June 15th for a show on butterfly photography with Daryl Gulen. Bye for now, and we'll talk soon.